ceux qui ne parlent que français, s'il vous plaît, levez la main pour vous donner.
And thank you for joining us today. Our topic that we decided to address during our 7-day trip in Istanbul is the wave of Syrian refugees in Turkey. Since the Syrian crisis has begun in 2010, there has been reported approximately 10 million Syrian refugees that have fled Syria. Of those 10 million, approximately 4 to 6 million of them reside within Turkey. Now, Turkey shares a very significant border with Syria, and that is why there's a massive influx of Syrians in Turkey. Along the Turkey-Syria border, there are approximately 24 refugee camps. In these refugee camps, there are 2 million Syrians in them. The Turkish government has been doing a great job in maintaining and really regulating these refugee camps, providing to its most services. Thus far, it has invested approximately almost $6 billion in these refugee camps to maintain them. So Turkey has been really doing a lot of investments in these Syrian refugees. When we first approached this project, however, we were curious to find out how does the Syrians navigate the new society in Turkey, and a new urban city, specifically in Istanbul. The Syrians, approximately the number of Syrians in Istanbul is 400 to 500,000. So we were also, as researchers, we were really interested in how do we bring awareness, maybe even access to resources to help Syrians integrate in Turkey. So in this way, we had many questions that revolved around the question of integration. How and whether it is possible for Syrians to integrate into the Istanbulite community. What is the government doing to help bridge the gap between the services and its programs, also in regards to NGOs and INGOs? And specifically, what are the struggles of Syrians? How do they perceive their new environment? And was really Turkey ready to open its borders for the Syrians?
So why did we choose Istanbul? Turkey in general first. So Turkey is a very religiously and ethnically diverse country. So we wanted to see how the Syrian crisis affected Turkey in general and how the Turkish population reacted and perceived the Syrian newcomers. And we chose Istanbul also specifically because Istanbul is a financial economic hub which attracts Syrian refugees, and not only refugees, by the way, it's also like migrants, also rural populations from Anatolia who come looking for opportunities in Istanbul. And it also happened to be the crossing point to Europe, so for Syrian refugees wanting to cross to Europe, that's the stop. And they usually stay there for a while, looking for opportunities to cross to Europe.
So before arriving to Istanbul, we had to rely on different sources, mainly on newspaper, on blog articles, in order to get a picture of the situation that those 400,000 Syrians are facing right now, because it's still a very current event. So now after our research, we can say that these images we saw and articles we read didn't exceed pointing out the visible, and add to a distorted portrayal in which the Syrian community is victimized, pitied, and disempowered. The headlines of newspapers, as well as government rhetorics, could lead an outsider to several premature assumptions, some of which we held our own before we embarked our journey to Istanbul. So in this presentation, we would like to debunk 6 of these myths, and by doing so, take you through our findings during our journey.
So for the first perception and the first myth says all Syrians who fled to Turkey are refugees. And I just want to quickly ask the audience, when you hear the word refugee, what comes to your mind? And you can just raise your hand really quickly and say a few things. Like, number 2 that describes a refugee. Diego?
Poverty, crisis,
Yes?
war.
Yes, exactly. So the term refugee actually is a very technical term and was established during the 51 and 67 UN conventions. A refugee is a person who is being persecuted and is thus by international law, once filing through refugee protection, can gain status. What is unique to Turkey, however, is Turkey has set a geographic limitation which does not allow these Syrians to apply for refugee status. Instead, what refugees can do is apply for asylum seeking, or in this sense, be asked to be placed in another country. So they can be temporarily in Turkey, but without a permanent status. So when they apply for this local temporary status, they can have access to 2 things: healthcare system, meaning hospitals, and the education system, which means schools. But besides that, if the Syrian has not made an attempt in the local government to apply for such asylum-seeking status, they are technically not legal in Turkey, which is a problem because that means that they don't have legal rights within Turkey itself.
So we have established that not all Syrians are refugees under a complicated situation in Turkey. The second myth that we're going to focus on is most Syrians in Istanbul live on the streets. This is not true. Not all Syrians are beggars and not all of them live on the streets. However, they have faced some very serious problems with the housing market in Istanbul and finding accommodation. So most of the Syrians migrate to Turkey in groups, so they follow their friends and family. They also settle down and find jobs this way, and they use whatever limited communication methods they have to live and work together in the same place. So communities within Istanbul have been slowly forming with this waves of migration, especially in the suburbs of Istanbul, where the industrial sector is concentrated, as well as more religiously conservative areas like Fatih that was presented in the first presentation of the day. So although not all Syrians live on the streets, it's really hard for them to find proper housing. Most families live together, they share one single apartment, others live in deserted buildings, or others move from one place to another like in a matter of a few weeks or days. So for the refugees that are legal with the government-issued ID cards that Dana mentioned, the rents increase immensely wherever they go, and this presents a problem both for the Syrians themselves, but also the Turks who are residing in the same area. Whereas the people who are not registered with the government, who are illegal, they face even graver problems in the housing market because their informal and illegal status makes the Turkish real estate agencies take advantage of them and demand really unreasonably high rents for them to find housing. So we have said that not all, so we can see that the Syrians are not living on the streets, they're not entirely miserable, and there are some few success stories that is worth mentioning. But it's also important to note that most of the success stories that we have encountered come from families or individuals that have been also well off in Syria, that came from upper classes in Syria. So during our trip to Istanbul, we had the chance to meet a Syrian chef, for example, who had fled the war 4 years ago. And in this course of 4 years he spent in Istanbul, he was able to set up a very successful restaurant chain. We also met a mother and a daughter. The former was an English teacher and the latter was studying media in the same Turkish private university. They had to leave the father of the family in Syria, which made their success very bittersweet. But they had told us that they do believe that there's a chance for Syrian migrants to find success and lead a prosperous life in Istanbul.
The next myth we're going to talk about is more of an implicit message that comes from government rhetoric. Especially now before the elections, the Turkish government is desperately trying to avoid the term integration when it comes to the Syrian community in the urban space. And since the beginning of the crisis, the government's approach to the emergency was very short-term oriented. And up until today, there's no really coordinated response in the city.